If you're just catching up with us, here's where things stood. I had spent 8 months of my pregnancy completely alone in Chicago after the father of my child panicked and flew back home to England. And somewhere in the middle of that loneliness, my obstetrician became the one person who made me feel like I mattered. On a freezing December night outside a small cafe near the hospital, what started as a simple goodbye turned into a kiss neither of us pulled away from. 2 minutes that felt like they held years of everything we'd both been too afraid to say. This is where the rest of our story begins. 2 days went by before either of us said a single word to each other outside of what my chart required. That silence sits at the center of everything I'm about to tell you, because it wasn't empty the way silence usually is. It was full, heavy with everything neither of us knew how to say out loud yet. If you're just joining this story, I want you to know we're picking up right after that kiss on the sidewalk outside the cafe, the one that changed everything between us in ways neither of us was ready for. And if this story means something to you, RP, forbidden romances is where these stories live. So stick around, because what happened next is the part I still find hardest to talk about. I spent those 2 days replaying it constantly, unable to focus on anything else, my hand drifting more than once to my own lips, like I could still feel the ghost of hers there. I told myself a dozen different stories about what it meant, that it was a mistake, born from exhaustion and loneliness, that it meant nothing at all, that it meant everything, and that terrified me more than any of the other possibilities combined. I didn't reach out to her. I didn't know how to, honestly, and some frightened part of me was afraid that if I did, she would tell me it had been a lapse in judgment, nothing more. I found out much later what those same 2 days looked like from her side of the city, and it still makes my chest tighten to imagine it. She told me she barely slept either night, lying awake in that quiet apartment overlooking the half-frozen lake, staring at a ceiling that had never once felt oppressive to her until now. She said the silence that used to feel like discipline suddenly felt unbearable, because for the first time in years, she knew exactly what was missing from it, and knowing made the absence so much louder than it had ever been before. She told me she nearly called me a dozen times, her phone in her hand, my name pulled up on the screen, before setting it back down every single time. Not because she didn't want to hear my voice. She wanted that more than she had wanted almost anything in longer than she could remember. She stopped herself because of everything standing behind that simple phone call, the ethic she had spent her entire career respecting, the responsibility she still carried as my doctor with my due date now only days away. She told me later that she sat with her father's old stethoscope in her hands that second night, the one memento she kept from him, running her thumb over it like it could remind her of the version of herself who had never once let her guard down like this. I didn't know any of that at the time. All I knew was the ache of not hearing from her, an ache that felt disproportionate to 2 days of silence, disproportionate to one single kiss on a cold sidewalk. I went about my days on autopilot, finishing the last of the nursery preparations, folding tiny clothes I had bought secondhand, all while some part of my mind stayed circling back to her face in that streetlight, the way her hand had felt cupped against my jaw. When my next appointment finally came, I walked into the hospital with my heart pounding so hard I was sure everyone in the waiting room could hear it. I didn't know what version of her I was going to find on the other side of that exam room door, the composed, professional doctor pretending nothing had happened, or someone else entirely. What I found instead was somewhere in between, and somehow that uncertainty was harder to sit with than either extreme would have been. She came in quieter than usual, her eyes finding mine for just a second, before dropping to my chart like it required more concentration than it actually did. Her hands, usually so steady, fumbled slightly with the blood pressure cuff, and I watched her notice her own hesitation and grow visibly frustrated with herself for it. Neither of us said anything about the kiss. We talked about dilation and due dates and hospital bags instead, 2 careful professionals discussing a pregnancy, both of us acting as though the ground hadn't completely shifted beneath our feet 4 days earlier. It was only at the very end of the appointment, as she was writing her final notes, that she paused, pen hovering above the paper, and finally looked up at me directly for the first time since walking in. There was something raw in her expression, something that looked almost like fear, though I hadn't yet seen fear look quite like that on her before. "I don't know how to do this," she said quietly, and I understood immediately that she wasn't talking about the delivery or the paperwork in front of her or anything medical at all. I sat there on the exam table, my heart in my throat, having absolutely no idea what to say back to her, only knowing that whatever came next was going to determine everything. The world outside my apartment window had gone fully white by the time I understood exactly what she meant by those words. It was the second week of December, snow finally settling over Chicago in earnest, and I had 2 days left before my due date, though none of us knew that yet. What I did know was that something had shifted between Rebecca and me that neither of us seemed ready to name, and that shift was about to collide head-on with everything she had built her entire career around protecting. She explained it to me slowly, sitting across from me in that same exam room, her voice careful in a way I hadn't heard from her before. She told me that as my physician, there were rules, real ones, not the kind you could simply decide to ignore because your heart had other plans. She told me that doctors weren't supposed to develop feelings for their patients, that it wasn't just frowned upon but actually dangerous, the kind of boundary crossing that could end a career built over almost 2 decades of discipline and sacrifice. I sat there listening, feeling my stomach twist tighter with every sentence, understanding that she wasn't just talking to me. She was talking herself through something, out loud, trying to find her way back to the version of herself who knew how to say no to this. I remember asking her quietly what that meant for us, and she looked away toward the window, toward the snow falling steadily past the glass. Before she answered, she told me she had been considering transferring my case to a colleague, someone who could deliver my daughter without any of this complicated weight hanging over the room. I felt something in my chest cave in when she said it, a fear so immediate and physical that I had to press my hand flat against the exam table just to steady myself. The thought of losing her, not just as whatever she was becoming to me, but as the one person who had shown up for me through this entire frightening chapter of my life, felt like losing solid ground beneath my feet. I told her I understood if she needed to do that, even though every part of me was screaming the opposite. I think some old, stubborn instinct in me still believed that being agreeable, being easy, being no trouble at all, was the safest way to keep people from leaving. I watched her face as I said it, and something in her expression cracked slightly, like my willingness to let her go hurt her more than any protest could have. What I didn't fully understand yet, not until she told me much later, was the shame she was carrying underneath all of that careful professional language. She told me she felt like she was betraying every value she had built her entire identity around, that she had spent years being the doctor other doctors called when a case felt impossible, the one who never let personal feeling cloud a single decision. And now here she was, 38 years old, unable to look at a patient's chart without her mind wandering somewhere it had no business going. She told me she felt, in her own words, like she was stealing something that wasn't hers to take, that I deserved a doctor who could see me clearly. And lately, she couldn't see me as anything other than someone she was quietly, helplessly falling for. I remember the particular ache of watching her return to that clinical distance for the rest of the appointment, answering my questions in a measured, careful voice, avoiding my eyes in a way that felt like grief, even though nothing had technically ended yet. When the appointment was over, she walked me to the door the way she always did, but this time she paused with her hand on the frame, not quite letting me pass. "I keep telling myself this is wrong," she said quietly, almost like she was confessing it to herself more than to me. "And then I see you, and none of that logic makes any sense anymore." I stood there in the doorway, my heart aching in a way that had nothing to do with the pregnancy. And I understood, maybe for the first time, exactly how much this was costing her to say out loud. This wasn't a woman playing with my feelings carelessly. This was a woman terrified of wanting something enough to risk everything she had spent her whole adult life building. I reached out, without fully deciding to, and touched her hand where it still rested against the doorframe. Neither of us said anything else. We just stood there for a long moment, her fingers slowly curling around mine, both of us caught in the exact same impossible question neither of us knew how to answer yet. Word had already started spreading through the hospital by the time the second week of December arrived, the way word always does in a place where everyone works too closely together to keep real secrets for long. I didn't know yet how much people had noticed. Not until Patricia, the nurse who had once warned me about Rebecca's reputation, pulled me aside near the elevators and told me gently that people were starting to talk. She said it kindly, not unkindly, but the words still landed like a stone dropping into my stomach. I found out later just how much pressure had already settled onto Rebecca's shoulders by then. A resident had apparently mentioned to a supervisor that Dr. Sinclair seemed distracted lately, unusually so, and that her efficiency, the thing she had built her entire reputation on, had started slipping in small, noticeable ways. She told me she overheard 2 nurses near the supply closet one afternoon, their voices dropping the way voices do when they think no one is listening, wondering aloud whether something was going on between her and a patient. She said hearing it out loud, spoken so casually, made something in her chest go cold with panic. She showed up at my apartment that night without calling first, which she had never done before. I remember opening the door to find her standing there in the falling snow, her coat dusted white at the shoulders, her expression carrying something I hadn't seen on her before, something close to desperation. I let her in without a word, and she stood in the middle of my small living room, not sitting, not taking off her coat, like she hadn't fully decided yet whether she was staying. "We can't do this," she said, before I had even closed the door behind her. Her voice was firm at first, rehearsed, like she had practiced the sentence the entire drive over. "You're my patient. You're about to have a baby. You deserve someone who can actually be there for you without all of this hanging over both of our heads. And I can't keep pretending I don't understand exactly how selfish it would be for me to stay." I didn't say anything right away. I just watched her, and I could see the argument already starting to crumble somewhere behind her eyes, even as the words kept coming. "I've spent my whole career building walls," she continued, and her voice cracked slightly on the last word, the first real crack I had ever heard in it. I told myself it was because I liked being alone, that I didn't need any of this, and now I can't sleep because I keep thinking about you, and I sit in my own apartment every night surrounded by everything I've supposedly built for myself, and none of it means anything anymore. I don't know how to keep pretending my life is fine when the only thing I actually want is something I'm not allowed to have. Her voice broke completely on that last sentence, and I watched, stunned, as tears started sliding down her face. This woman the entire hospital was afraid of, standing in my living room falling apart in front of me. I had never seen her cry before. I don't think many people ever had. I crossed the room without thinking and put my arms around her, and she let me, her whole body shaking slightly, as everything she had been holding together for weeks finally gave way. "I keep telling myself we can't do this," she whispered against my shoulder, her voice raw and unguarded in a way I don't think she had allowed herself to be with anyone in years. "And every single time, it's a lie the moment I say it. I don't know how to walk away from you. I've tried, and I can't." I held her there in the middle of my small living room, snow still falling silently outside the window, and I understood, maybe more clearly than I had understood anything in months, that neither of us was going to be able to talk ourselves out of this. Whatever moral line she had tried to draw between us had already dissolved somewhere between the kiss on that sidewalk and this exact moment, her tears soaking into my sweater, both of us finally admitting there was no version of this where either of us walked away untouched. I didn't have an answer for her that night. I just held on, and eventually so did she, and that was its own kind of answer, quiet and imperfect, but real. The wind had died down by the time my labor actually started, replaced by that particular muffled silence that only comes after a heavy snowfall. The whole city quieted under white. It was 2 a.m. when the first real contraction hit, sharp enough to pull me straight out of sleep, and I remember lying there in the dark for a moment, waiting to see if it would happen again before I let myself believe this was really it. By the time I called the hospital, the contractions were already coming close together, faster than any of the pamphlets had prepared me for. I remember my hands shaking as I gathered the bag I had packed weeks earlier, my mind moving in strange, disconnected fragments, equal parts terror and disbelief that after everything, after months of preparing to do this completely alone, the moment had actually arrived. I called a cab because I had no one else to call, and I sat in the back seat with my arms wrapped around my belly, breathing through the pain the way I had practiced, alone, in videos I watched late at night. I don't fully know how she found out I was in labor before I even arrived, since it wasn't her night on call. I found out later that Patricia had texted her the moment my name came through on the admissions list, some quiet understanding having passed between the hospital staff by then about what Rebecca would want to know. What I do know is that I hadn't been in my hospital bed more than 20 minutes, gripping the side rail through another contraction, when the door opened and she walked in, still in her coat, snow still melting in her dark hair, her eyes finding mine immediately across the room. "I'm here," she said, crossing the room in a few quick steps, and something in me that had been braced rigid for hours finally loosened at the sound of her voice. She wasn't on call. She had no obligation to be standing in that room at 4 a.m. She was there because she couldn't stand the thought of me going through this without her. And I understood, in that single moment, exactly how much things between us had already changed. She took my hand and didn't let go. Not through the next contraction, not through the ones after that, staying beside me even as the actual medical team took over the technical parts of the delivery. She talked me through every wave of pain in that same steady voice she'd used the day of my anxiety attack, telling me I was strong, telling me I wasn't alone, telling me, at one especially difficult moment, that she wasn't going anywhere. I believed her completely, in a way I hadn't let myself believe anyone in longer than I could remember. The hours blurred together after that. Pain and exhaustion and the particular hush of a hospital at that hour. Until finally, close to sunrise, everything narrowed down to one final overwhelming push. I remember the sound before I remember anything else. A small, furious cry filling the room, and I remember Rebecca's face, right beside mine, break into an expression I had never seen on her before. Something completely undone, completely unguarded, tears sliding freely down her cheeks as she watched my daughter enter the world. For just a moment, before anyone else moved, it was Rebecca who received her, wrapping her gently, holding her close for a few suspended seconds that felt like they stretched far longer than they actually did. I watched her look down at my daughter's small face, and something passed over her own expression that I recognized instantly, because I had felt the exact same thing happen inside my own chest months earlier. Something ancient, unexpected, and enormous, waking up inside her all at once. She carried my daughter the short distance to my arms herself, and as she placed her gently against my chest, our eyes met over the top of that tiny, impossibly perfect head, and neither of us needed to say a single word. I felt tears sliding down my own face, exhaustion and joy, and something else entirely tangled together, and Rebecca leaned down, pressing a soft kiss to my forehead, the first time she had ever touched me that way in front of anyone else in the room. Nobody in that room said a word about it. I think, by then, some of them already understood exactly what they were witnessing. I lay there in the pale, early light coming through the window, my daughter warm against my chest, Rebecca's hand still wrapped gently around mine, and I understood, with a certainty that felt more solid than anything else in my entire life up to that point, that whatever this was between us, whatever line had been crossed to bring us here, it had led us to exactly where we were always supposed to be. I didn't know what to call her at first, in those early weeks. Not girlfriend, not partner, nothing that felt big enough or official enough for what had happened between us. And yet somehow that didn't seem to matter as much as I thought it would. What mattered was that she was there, morning after morning, showing up at my door with groceries before her shift, staying late into the night when my daughter wouldn't settle, learning the particular rhythm of a household that had, until very recently, belonged to no one but me. Chicago in January is not a forgiving place, and that winter felt especially long. The snow piling higher along the sidewalks with every storm, the sky staying gray and low for days at a time. I remember how different my small apartment felt with her presence woven into it, though. The radiator that never worked quite right somehow stopped mattering as much once she started showing up with an extra blanket, draping it over both of us on the nights we sat together on my worn couch, my daughter asleep between us, neither one of us saying much of anything, just existing quietly in each other's company. She learned things about newborns faster than I expected from someone whose entire medical career had been focused on the moments right before birth, rather than everything that came after. She learned how to hold my daughter so she'd finally stop crying at 3 a.m, some particular sway she discovered through trial and error that worked better than anything the book suggested. I remember watching her from the hallway one of those nights, exhaustion blurring my vision slightly, seeing her pace slowly across my living room with my daughter tucked against her shoulder, murmuring something low and soothing I couldn't quite make out, and feeling something in my chest ache with a tenderness I hadn't expected to feel watching someone else hold my child. We never had a real conversation about what we were becoming to each other. It happened instead in smaller ways. In the toothbrush she eventually left in my bathroom, in the extra key I gave her without either of us discussing it out loud, in the easy, unspoken assumption that grew between us that she would simply be there, again and again, without either of us needing to ask. I think we were both a little afraid of naming it too soon, worried that giving it an official shape might somehow make it more fragile, more likely to break under the weight of everything it had already survived to exist at all. She had gone back to being my daughter's doctor for those first newborn appointments, since technically the ethical concerns that mattered most applied to my own pregnancy rather than my daughter's pediatric care, though I know she still carried some quiet discomfort about how tangled our lives had become. I remember her mentioning, almost offhandedly one evening, that she had started looking into whether she needed to formally transfer even that small remaining piece of medical involvement, just to be certain there was no question left hanging over either of our heads. I watched her say it, careful and deliberate, and understood that some part of her was still working through what it meant to have crossed a line she had spent her whole career respecting, even now, months after that line had already been crossed for good. There were nights, especially the hardest ones, when I would catch her staring at my daughter with an expression I didn't fully understand yet, something that looked almost like disbelief, like she still couldn't quite trust that any of this belonged to her too. I asked her about it once, late on a particularly difficult night when neither of us could get my daughter to settle, and she admitted, quietly, that she had never let herself imagine a life like this, a real home, a child falling asleep against her shoulder, because she had convinced herself decades ago that this kind of life simply wasn't meant for her. I remember reaching for her hand across the space between us on the couch that night, my daughter finally quiet between us, and telling her that I hadn't imagined it either. Not really. Not after everything that had happened with Michael. Not after crossing an entire ocean alone to build a life I wasn't sure I even wanted anymore. I told her that whatever this was, however unplanned and complicated it had turned out to be, it felt more like home than anything I had known in years. She didn't say anything back right away. She just laced her fingers through mine, resting her head against my shoulder, and for a long moment, the three of us just sat there together in the quiet, snow falling softly outside the window, none of us needing any more words than that. I didn't know yet, sitting there in that fragile, unnamed peace, how quickly things were about to get complicated again. I didn't know that the very quiet, careful happiness we had built in those first weeks was about to be tested by fears neither of us had fully faced yet. Fears that had nothing to do with hospital ethics or nervous nurses gossiping in hallways, and everything to do with two people who had spent their whole lives believing they weren't allowed to be loved the way they secretly needed to be. I could feel the shift happening before either of us said a word about it, the way certain feelings arrive quietly, and then all at once. By the time February settled over Chicago, Something between Rebecca and me had stopped feeling like something new and fragile, and had started feeling instead like something we had simply always been building toward, even before we knew each other's names. It showed up first in the smallest moments. The morning she woke before me and I found her already in the kitchen, my daughter propped against her shoulder while she made coffee one-handed, humming something low and half-remembered under her breath. I stood in the doorway for a long moment, just watching them, this woman the entire hospital still spoke of in careful, respectful tones, swaying gently side to side in my kitchen in a soft gray sweater, completely unguarded in a way I don't think anyone outside that room had ever seen her. She caught me watching eventually, and instead of the flicker of self-consciousness I expected, she just smiled, warm and easy, and said, "She likes it when I hum the low notes. I think it's the vibration." I remember crossing the kitchen and wrapping my arms around both of them from behind, resting my chin against her shoulder, breathing in the familiar scent of her, leather and vanilla, and now, faintly, the milk and lavender smell that had started clinging to everything in our small apartment. It didn't feel like watching someone learn to love my daughter. It felt like watching someone remember how to love, period, after years of convincing herself she didn't need to. The complicity between us grew in ways neither of us had to negotiate out loud. I started reaching for her hand without thinking about it, in the grocery store, on the sidewalk, at my daughter's 2-month checkup. And she started reaching back the same way, easy and certain, like it had always been this simple. We developed our own private language, small glances across a room that meant an entire conversation. The particular way she would raise one eyebrow at me over a strange comment from a stranger, and I would have to bite back a laugh. I hadn't realized how much I missed that kind of intimacy, the kind that doesn't need words at all, until I had it again. There was an evening, my daughter finally asleep in the next room, when Rebecca pulled me down onto the couch beside her, tucking me against her side the way she'd started doing most nights, and just held me there for a long, quiet while, her fingers tracing slow, absent patterns against my arm. "I keep waiting to feel like this is too much," she admitted quietly, her voice low in the dim light of the living room lamp. "Too much responsibility, too fast, too complicated, and I keep not feeling that at all. I just feel like I finally understand what I was missing all those years." I turned my face up toward hers, and something in the way she looked back at me, unguarded and certain, made my chest tighten with a feeling too large to hold quietly. I reached up and traced my fingers along her jaw, feeling her breath catch softly beneath my touch. And I told her the truth I had been carrying for weeks, that I hadn't just fallen for the woman who showed up at 3 a.m. to help with a crying baby, or the woman who had once held my hand through an anxiety attack in an exam room. I had fallen for all of her, completely, the fierce, guarded parts and the tender, newly awakened parts alike, and I didn't want to spend one more day pretending that wasn't true. She didn't say anything back right away. She just leaned in slowly, her hand coming up to cup my face the way it had that very first night outside the cafe, and kissed me with a tenderness that felt different from anything before it, less like something forbidden finally breaking free, and more like something patient and certain finally being allowed to exist in the open. Her thumb brushed slowly along my cheekbone as the kiss deepened, unhurried, full of every quiet month that had led us here. And I felt her breath tremble against mine in a way that told me she felt exactly what I felt, whole and terrified and undeniably sure all at once. When we finally broke apart, her forehead resting gently against mine, she whispered something I don't think she had ever said to another living person before. "I love you," she said, simple and unguarded, like the words had been waiting patiently behind years of locked doors for exactly this moment to finally be spoken. I felt my own eyes fill with tears, happy ones this time, and I told her I loved her too, that I had for longer than I probably wanted to admit even to myself. We sat there together in the soft lamplight, wrapped around each other, my daughter sleeping peacefully just down the hall. And for the first time since arriving in this country completely alone, I I finally understood what it meant to build a family out of nothing but two broken, hopeful hearts, finding each other at exactly the right moment. We didn't make any grand announcement about it. Not at first. It just started showing in small, ordinary ways that gradually became impossible to hide, and neither of us particularly wanted to hide it anymore anyway. Rebecca began walking me to my daughter's pediatric appointments hand in hand, no longer glancing around the hallway first the way she used to. She started bringing me lunch on my slower work days, sitting across from me in the hospital cafeteria in full view of anyone who cared to notice, and plenty of people did notice, though by then, the whispers had softened into something closer to quiet approval than gossip. Patricia was the first to say something out loud about it, catching me alone by the elevators one afternoon with my daughter balanced on my hip. She didn't ask, exactly. She just looked at the two of us, and then glanced meaningfully toward Rebecca's office down the hall, and smiled in a way that told me she had probably known, long before either of us admitted it to ourselves. "About time," she said simply, squeezing my arm before she walked away, and I remember laughing all the way to the parking garage, lighter than I had felt in months. Rebecca told me later that something had shifted for her too, once she stopped trying to manage what people thought and simply let herself be seen. She said she used to walk through those hospital hallways bracing for judgment at every turn, and instead, she found something closer to warmth waiting for her. Colleagues who had quietly hoped, for years, that she would eventually let someone in. She told me she hadn't understood how much energy she'd spent guarding herself until she finally stopped, and how much lighter she felt once she did. We moved in together that spring, once the last of the snow had finally melted off the sidewalks, and the lake had gone from a hard, frozen gray back to something bright and moving again. It wasn't a dramatic decision. It felt, if anything, like simply admitting out loud what had already been true for months, that neither of us wanted to spend another night apart if we didn't have to. I remember standing in the new apartment we found together, boxes still half unpacked around us, watching Rebecca hang a small mobile above my daughter's crib with more care than I had ever seen her give to anything else, and thinking that this, finally, was what home was supposed to feel like. My daughter's first word that summer was, unmistakably, some soft, garbled attempt at mama directed at both of us equally. And I watched Rebecca's face crumble into happy tears the first time it happened. This woman who had once terrified an entire hospital undone completely by one small, delighted baby babbling in a sunlit kitchen. She picked my daughter up and held her close, pressing kisses into her soft hair, and looked at me over the top of her head with an expression so full of quiet joy that I felt my own eyes fill with tears too. We built our life slowly and deliberately after that, the way people do when they've both already learned the cost of taking love for granted. Sunday mornings became sacred. The three of us tangled together in bed longer than we probably should have been, coffee going cold on the nightstand, while my daughter babbled happily between us. Rebecca still worked long hours, still commanded that same quiet authority throughout the hospital, but she came home every single night now to noise and warmth and small, sticky handprints on the furniture, and she told me, more than once, that she couldn't remember what her life had felt like before all of it, before us. There was an evening, almost a year after that first appointment in her exam room, when Rebecca sat me down on our small balcony overlooking the lake, my daughter already asleep inside, the summer air warm and soft around us. She took my hand in both of hers and told me that meeting me had cracked open a version of herself she hadn't even known was still in there, waiting patiently through all those disciplined, lonely years for exactly this. She told me she used to believe love was something other people got to have, something that had simply passed her by while she built her career instead. She said watching me raise my daughter, watching the two of us slowly become her family too, had taught her that it was never too late for any of that to still find her. I remember resting my head against her shoulder that evening, watching the last light fade gold over the water, feeling more certain of anything in my whole life than I had ever felt of this. Whatever had started as something forbidden, something neither of us should have allowed ourselves to want, had grown into something neither of us could imagine living without anymore. I didn't know yet, sitting there in that soft summer evening. Exactly where the next few years would take the three of us. I only knew, with complete and quiet certainty, that wherever it was, we would be going there together. 5 years passed before I ever imagined standing where I was standing that evening. Though somehow, looking back, it feels like every single one of those years had been quietly leading us there all along. We had flown to Paris that autumn, the three of us, my daughter now old enough to press her small hands against the airplane window the entire descent, asking 100 questions about the city glowing gold beneath us. Rebecca had planned the trip herself, down to the smallest detail, though I didn't understand yet just how much thought had gone into that particular evening until it was already unfolding around me. We had dinner reservations at a restaurant with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Eiffel Tower. The whole city stretched out gold and glittering below us as the sky slowly deepened into evening. My daughter sat between us, 7 years old by then, chattering happily about the tiny pastries she'd eaten earlier that day, completely unaware of the quiet nervousness I noticed settling over Rebecca as the evening went on. I remember catching her hand trembling slightly as she reached for her water glass, and thinking, with a small, fond smile, how strange it still was to see that particular tremor in a woman who commanded entire hospital wings without a flicker of hesitation. The tower lit up right on schedule, the whole structure suddenly sparkling against the darkening sky, and my daughter gasped so loudly that half the restaurant turned to smile at her delight. I was laughing at her reaction, still watching the lights, when I realized Rebecca had gone quiet beside me. I turned to find her already looking at me, something in her expression steadier and more open than I had ever seen it, even in all our years together. And before I fully understood what was happening, she had slid out of her chair and gone down on one knee beside our table. The restaurant seemed to hold its breath along with me. She took my hand in both of hers, the same steady hands that had once calmed me through a panic attack in an exam room years earlier. The same hands that had caught my daughter's first breath in this world. And her voice, when she finally spoke, carried none of its old careful composure. It was raw, open, entirely hers. I spent almost 40 years of my life believing I wasn't meant for this, she said, tears already gathering in her eyes. I built an entire career instead of a family because I was terrified of exactly this kind of wanting. And then you walked into my exam room, completely alone and trying so hard to be brave about it. And something in me that I thought was permanently closed just quietly opened back up. I felt my own eyes fill with tears, my daughter going still and wide-eyed beside me, sensing the importance of the moment, even without fully understanding it yet. I used to think the line I crossed with you was the biggest mistake of my career, Rebecca continued, her voice steadying now, certain in a way that made my chest ache with how much I loved her. I know now it was the only decision I ever made that actually made sense. You didn't just give me a family, Valentina. You gave me a reason to stop being afraid of my own life. She opened the small box in her hand, and I barely registered the ring inside it, through the blur of my own tears. Marry me, she said simply. Let me spend the rest of my life making sure neither of us is ever alone again. I said yes, before she had even finished the question, pulling her up into my arms right there beside the table, both of us laughing and crying at the same time, while the entire restaurant broke into applause around us. My daughter wrapped her arms around both our legs, demanding to know if this meant Rebecca was officially her mom now too. And Rebecca knelt back down to her level, tears still on her cheeks, and told her she had been her mom in every way that mattered for a very long time now, and this evening just made it official for everyone else to see. Looking back on that night now, I think about how far we both traveled to get there. Not just the physical distance from that cold exam room in Chicago to a lit-up tower in Paris, but the much longer distance from two women who believed they were meant to face life alone, to a family built entirely out of the courage it took to finally let someone in. That's our story, or at least the part of it I felt ready to share with you. What started as something neither of us should have allowed ourselves to want became the truest, steadiest love either of us has ever known. Proof, I think, that sometimes the line you're most afraid to cross is exactly the one that leads you home. If you've stayed with me through all of this, thank you for listening to something so personal. If this story moved you the way it still moves me every time I think back on it, please consider joining us over on Patreon, where we share even more of these stories, deeper and more intimate than what we're able to share here. Leave a like if you're feeling what I'm feeling right now, and drop a comment telling me where in the world you're listening from tonight. Thank you for being here with us until the very end.